I'm sitting today because of age and my back. So, yeah, young people, this happens. No, you can't do anything about it, you know. But this should always remind you of the heavenly body we will get one day when we will be with our Lord. And I'm serious about that, right? I mean, you live life, you get to, what do you think? 17 is when you hit your prime because before 17, you're still kind of like gangly and awkward. 17, 18, you go to college, you have all this time to start like going to the gym all the time, you get real buff, right? And it doesn't last that long. 25, that was my age. 25, I definitely was like, oh, I'm past my prime. By 27, it was, like I should have sold this body because I already lost a lot of value, right? And so now that I'm in my mid 40s, yeah, stuff happens, especially if you have a baby who weighs a ton. To hold it, and that's very wiggly and kicky and just like he's back there, that happens. Okay, so it is what it is, and I will look forward to that new body that I will get one day, where I can apparently, if we look at Jesus and his resurrection body, I can teleport and maybe like walk through walls or something. We don't really know, but we got some stuff in the New Testament that kind of shows that. Okay? All right, so we are moving on in our Bible series. We are now in 2 Samuel part 2. We're in chapters 6 to 7. These are some of God's promises. All right? Here's the funny thing about promises. You don't need to teach children about the importance of promises. They just know instinctively. They won't remember to ever turn the lights off in their room when they leave. They won't remember that when they throw their dirty clothes in the laundry, they should take their socks and not have it inside out with their shirts, They won't remember any of that. But when you make a half-hearted, flippant promise like a week ago, and they, fulfill those requirements like taking a shower, they'll say, hey, don't you remember last week, it was in the mid-60s, humidity was about 45%, the sun was there shining in, and you said, if we do this, we can have a special treat. And I've got to be like, what? They remember, and if you like change your minds, like, oh, come, I didn't really mean that. It's, how could you? How could you? You said we could do it. So promises are a big deal, and when we break them, it's a big deal, right? And it's not something that you have to, teach somebody. They just kind of know. And so, and so far in the Bible, we've seen God give promises in different examples of that, like his covenant with Abraham, right? So covenants are a little bit different than promises because a covenant has kind of like a two-way thing. There are requirements to kind of fulfill. And we see in the Bible so far that people have repeatedly not lived up to those conditions. And yet God continues to renew his covenant with his people, and this is out of his love and grace. So in chapters 6 and 7, what we're going to see is God give David a promise, or more than one promise. And so let's get into it, and then we'll see what's going on. Right, so chapter 6, David gets sturdy, and Uzzah does not. All right? For young people will know that sturdy is apparently a dance. My kids had to tell me this. And I was like, really? Oh, really? And I had to look it up. And I was like, oh, is that what 5th and 6th graders do now? Or, but apparently it's a dance. I would demonstrate, but my back hurts, so I'm not going to do it right now, okay? But chapter 6 is all about how the Ark of the Covenant gets to Jerusalem. That's the chapter. Okay, so back in Exodus, God commands the Israelites to make an ark, and you'll see a picture of it And it's basically, it's like a sacred chest. It's like a rectangular wooden box that's overlaid with gold. It's a little bit it's a little under 4 feet long and a little bit over 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall, right? And so this is kind of a picture of what it could have looked like. Um, and inside the ark contained the tablets of the law that God gave to Moses back in Exodus 25. And there's also a jar of manna in there. This is when God provided manna for the Israelites in Exodus 16. God tells them to kind of keep a jar of it preserved. It's kind of neat. To remind the Israelites how God provided. And the third item, this is the one that most of the time people forget, is Aaron's budded staff. Right? And so basically, there was a time when people started to rebel, and they said, Aaron, why does he get to be the high priest? And so God's like, okay, guys, like, let me tell you who I'm going to pick. And so get all your staves and like put them here. And the next day, the one that like buds will be the one to pick. And so Aaron's staff, remember, it's not a branch that's connected to a tree, it's just a stick, right? But it's actually buds and has fruit on it. And it's like, oh, Aaron, right? And so that was another thing they put in there. So those are the three things. And so the ark up to now had been in a town called Bala. All right, and it's about 10 miles west of Jerusalem. And so 10 miles, if you've gone hiking, 10 miles is a pretty good hike. It's doable in a day, right? But it's a while away, and of course you also have to carry this ark. So that's a pain. So what they do is they put the ark on a cart that's pulled by oxen, and they start bringing it towards Jerusalem. But unfortunately, the roads in ancient Israel are very similar to the roads in Connecticut, filled with potholes everywhere, okay? And the Department of Transportation is not filling them. They're just, they're all rickety. And the oxen stumble, and the ark is about to fall off. And one of the Levites named Uzzah reaches out to touch it, to kind of like, hey, we don't want this thing to fall. But here's the thing. Back in Numbers 4, God prohibits anyone from touching the ark. It's like, hey, this ark it's a big deal, so you can't touch it. That's why they have these poles on these there's rings on the ark. They put the poles through, and that's how they carry it. You don't actually touch the ark, because if you do, you'll die. Now Uzzah, who is a Levite, and so therefore was trained in all this, should have known. But he touches it, and he dies. And so this is one of those things, when I was a kid, I was always sat there and wondered, why did Uzzah have to? It just seems a little extreme. I can understand where God's like, hey, don't be like getting your greasy fingers on this thing. This is really important. But, it's falling. Like that. And so I don't know if you've wondered about that, but I certainly did. But here's the thing. For this particular issue, I want to give you 3 points to think about that where it kind of starts to make sense. Oh, okay, this is why this is happening. I think the first one, it points to the gravity of God. When I say gravity, I don't mean like mass and how things are getting sucked in, but more like the, for lack of a better word, bigness, the greatness, the severity, and just like the vastness of God. It points to that like, hey, like this ark is not just a box that's covered in gold. This is really big. This is really important. And when God says, hey, this is how we're going to treat this, I think we got to take it seriously. Okay. The second thing is this. Remember, this is early era of God's people. Okay. When you raise children, the way you discipline them when they're younger is very different than the way you discipline them when they're older. Okay? There are just things you do and discipline when they're younger, because it's like, you don't get it, like you can barely speak, and we got to teach you certain things, and we discipline differently than when you're 17, a senior in high school, getting ready to go to college or whatever, and like you're like almost an adult. Your parents will treat you differently. Well, at least they should. Hopefully, your parents don't treat you like a 2-year-old if you're getting ready to college. But because your relationship with your parents has grown and changed. And so also the relationship between God and his people is also growing, right? And so, but this is early on. So there's just the way God kind of works and disciplines and deals with his people early on is very different than he does later on, okay? It doesn't mean that, like, oh no, God has somehow changed or anything like that. No, this is just the growth of the relationship, okay? Verse 2. The last one is this. If you look at this from an eternal perspective, it's actually not that extreme. Think about it from Uzzah's perspective, right? Like, I don't know how he died, if it was like painful or just like he touched it, it's like zap, right? And now he's standing before the Lord. And this, now, okay, pause. This is not in the Bible. This is how Gene is thinking about this, okay? So definitely don't take this like, oh, this is the word of God, and like this is just how Gene's thinking about it, okay? But bear with me. Uzzah's now standing before the Lord. I'm wondering if he has some questions, like, am I on the road to Jerusalem? Like, what happened? And God's gonna have to explain to him, you're dead. And here's why. Now Uzzah might be, oh, that was kind of extreme, God. But think about what Uzzah is now experiencing. Now he's a Levite. He's been faithful, right? So God, if he explains it kind of the way I just talked about it, right? It's like, hey, we had to show the people how big of a deal this is, right? And Uzzah's like, oh, okay. And God might say, you also get to be in heaven now, right? You don't have to deal with a lot of stuff. You don't have to deal with back pain. You don't have to deal with all, like, you are now in heaven, and it gets your name in the Bible, right? Now, if I were Uzzah, honestly, I'd be like, well, there were some things I would like to do in life. But this is actually not that bad of a deal. Now, I'm not saying, like, death, like all death is like this, but in this particular case, where there was a reason for why Uzzah's not supposed to touch this, and how this is in a pivotal moment in the life of God's people. All of a sudden, when you take these three ideas in mind, it's like, oh, it's not as extreme as we think. Now, I'm not saying you need to sit there and be like, okay, I have no issues with it. That's fine. If you're still like struggling with it, that's totally fine. I'm just sharing with you how I've kind of like dealt with this over the decades I've been a Christian, like thinking through this and like, okay? So I just want to share that with you because I struggled with it early in my faith, okay? So if you didn't struggle with this, then I just wasted a couple minutes. I'm sorry, okay? All right, so that happens, okay? After this incident, the ark's journey, that 10-mile journey, gets paused. Because, why? Because from David's perspective, this is kind of a killjoy. You know, like, hey, we're celebrating. I was like, oh, the guy died, right? So it gets paused. In verse 9 to 11, it says, David was afraid of the Lord that day, understandably, and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him, that's Obed-Edom, and his entire household. Right? And so David here understood the gravity of God. He understood like the vastness and the greatness of God here. Right? And so he's like, oh, whoa, I'm just gonna pause this. Like, I don't know what's going on and what's gonna happen. So I'm just gonna leave it here. And we're gonna pause this, okay? And then God then blesses Obed-Edom, who has this ark in his home, okay? And but here's the thing, though. I think a lot of times we understand the vastness and the greatness of God, but we understand it more on like the wrath side. That like, hey, you know, God has a lot of power, and He could like really destroy you and punish you and all that. And like, sure, right? And we've seen that in the Bible. Do you remember when the Philistines got the ark and they brought it into whatever city the Philistines put it in, like calamity happened. And eventually there's like, we can't deal with this. Just give it back, right? Just give it back to the Israelites. We don't want this anymore. And so we definitely have that. But here we see that Obed-Edom's family is blessed, right? And so, yes, God's greatness and his gravity, there's wrath there. But don't ever forget about God's greatness in his grace. And his grace is always, like, it is so much greater than his wrath. Okay? So that's important to remember. Okay? And so after 3 months, David sees, things are going well. He finally brings the ark to Jerusalem. All right? And then we have David's famous dance scene. All right? And this is in verse 16 and then 20 to 22. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, that's David's one of David's wives, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. And in verse 20, when David returned home, Michal said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." Right, this is one of those famous scenes, especially for worship leaders. And they're always like, hey, look at David. So when we sing, put your hands in the air and, clap or do something, sure, yes, okay, that does apply here. But it's so much more than just how can we worship the Lord with more exuberance. It's so much bigger than that. And I want to look at this. Look at Michal's focus and then look at David's focus, okay? All right. Michal's focus was on the person of David. Her focus was on a person, David, and how he appeared on the outside and how others viewed him. Right? So her focus was, look at David and look at how other people are viewing him. He's the king. He should be a little bit more distinguished than that. Like that's where her eyes are. That's where her focus is. David, on the other hand, is not focused on himself or anybody. He is focused on the Lord and the fact that God is so great. And he's gladly willing to, look foolish or humiliate himself while praising him. That word that they use that translate into undignified can also be translated into lightly esteemed, right? So it's kind of it is undignified, right? It is the idea of, okay, I'll humiliate myself, but the heart of it is really not about David. It's about that like relationship between David and God. That David is putting God so high that God's the way he views God is so high that in comparison, it's as if he is undignified. Okay, do you understand? So the point is not, hey, let's or David is going to be humiliated, undignified, or look silly and dancing, doing the sturdy or whatever dance is popular, right? The point is that David's saying, no, I'm putting God high, and I'll be as low as I have to be. Okay, so that's the two differences, right? And so the question for us is, where is our focus? And not just in worship, right? Because sometimes this is a legitimate question. It's like, when we are worshiping the Lord, are we worried about how we might look? And that's how a lot of church leaders talk about this. Yeah, okay, like, do I want to look like I'm a prim and proper stoic Asian man? I'm just stand there and worship because that's how we are, or am I gonna shift around a little bit, move my legs? Yes, but it's so much more than that, and it goes into not just our church life and we worship, but also just in our lives in general. Like, do we, with our lives, lift up the Lord at whatever cost, right, of how we may look and be perceived? Okay, so that's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is the promise. And so the ark is now moved to Jerusalem, and now David is just sitting back and talking, and he's talking with Nathan. It's like a new character. Nathan's like the new prophet, right? Talking with Nathan, says, "Hey Nathan, I want to build God a home, a temple, and it's gonna be awesome." And Nathan's sitting back with him. He's like, "Sounds great. Go for it." But the problem is, no one asked God about this, right? And so afterwards, God tells Nathan, "Hey, you guys didn't really consult me on this." And Nathan tells God to tell David, "No, David is not going to be the one that builds the temple. It's going to be his son." But he also wants to give David this promise. Okay. And then in verse 11 to 16, this is Nathan relaying God's message to David. Right. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And so here God gives David his promise, right? The promise that the temple will be built, but it's not going to be built by you. It's going to be built by one of your sons, and that David's throne will be established forever. Now, here's the really neat thing, right? From David's perspective, he's probably thinking about like an earthly kingdom. That's actually not what God means, because this promise is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, a kingdom that is established forever. And that's the thing about God's promises. It's often not what we think, and it's often way greater than we can imagine. Right? David's just thinking about his little piece of land, right? Relative to the world, Israel's tiny, right? He's just thinking about his piece of land. He's like, yeah, my line is going to be having this piece of land, and we're going to have this kingdom. Hooray! God's like, no. God's like, yeah, sure. But it's like, this kingdom I'm talking about that is going to go through your line is my kingdom, is God's kingdom, right? It's so much greater. It's like God as a human in Jesus. That's going to come through your line. That is so much greater than a nation on earth. Right? And so God's promises for us are often not what we think about, but it's so much greater than we can imagine. And then chapter 7 ends with David's prayer in response to God's promise. So Nathan goes back to David and said, hey, remember that conversation we had yesterday? My bad. We kind of went a little, we kind of got ahead of ourselves. Here's what God is saying, and David responds. And we read some of it earlier on. This was in chapter 7, verse 18 to 24. And here I'm going to read just a couple verses of it. David's response, again, he is focused on who he is compared to God. Right? So the focus is really on God, not on him, but it's that comparison of who he's compared to God. He says, who am I, sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? And 22, how great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And then in 24, you have established your people Israel as your very own forever. And you, Lord, have become their God. This understanding the relationship between who we are and who God is so important. I think that's where a lot of times we stumble with our faith and we start to lose sight of that relationship. Okay, because if we err in one or the other direction, one direction would be that we start to think we are so great, that we're like holy because we're God's chosen people, and God chose me, and I've said the prayer and all that kind of. If we start to err on that side, it leads to arrogance. It leads, and ultimately that leads to cruelty, right? That somehow we are better because God has chosen us. And it leads to that. And we lose so much what God has called for us. We lose sympathy, we lose empathy, we lose compassion and kindness and grace and forgiveness when we start to think, oh, we are so great and we are holy. But on the other side, that's a problem too. Because erring on the side of thinking we are so great, I'm going to be honest, culturally speaking, in our context, which is mostly Asian culture, we usually don't err on that side. Like that's just culturally, you don't end that way. We lean the other way. Right? That we start to think we are so bad, we're not good enough, and God must be disappointed in me because of my failures. And then we back it up with all the evidence of our failures in life, which are totally true, right? But if we err that way, what happens, it leads to despair and ultimately apathy, right? You start to look at your faith and how you're walking with the Lord, and you're just like, oh my goodness, I'm terrible, and I keep messing up, and I keep messing up over and over and over again. I'm not getting this right. And when you start to feel that way, why bother trying? Because you tried so many times and it failed, and we just get apathetic. And then when that starts to happen, we lose courage, we lose initiative, and we lose any kind of action. We start to just pull back and say, I'm not going to do anything with my faith because every time I try, I fail, and God is disappointed in me, and I just don't like feeling that way, so I'm just not going to do anything. I'm going to do the minimum I can to not go to hell, and I'll just kind of scoot in. Maybe God won't even notice me. I'll just kind of scoot in, and then they'll be like, I'm in heaven, and God didn't notice at the door because he was talking to some holy person, Like we feel that way, and but that is so wrong, And I think for us that might be how we err. And so getting that like a relationship right, like understanding who God is, how great God is, and then who we are and how we compare, but then understanding that is so important, because when we err one or the other way, it just creates a lot of problems. And then the second half of chapter 7, the second half of his prayer, this is verse 25 to 29, David focuses now on God's promise and the certainty of that promise because of who God is, not because of who David is. Right? I'm going to read verse 25 and then 27, 28. And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Lord Almighty, God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Right? We can take hold of God's promise in our lives when we take our focus away from ourselves and put them on God. David here, he once God gives him this promise, he is certain, and he is going to say yes, this promise is going to happen. But he says it in a way that's not like, oh, God's going to do this. It's just like, God, you do it. Like you said it, you do it. Because God, that's who you are. Right? And I think that's kind of how we have to view God. Like when God makes this promise, don't stop worrying about who you are focus on the Lord, when God makes his promises, which he has, it will come. And so for us today, how should we think about these two chapters? I think there's three things I want us to kind of remember. The first one is this: are you willing to lower yourself to lift up God? Are you willing to do that? Remember, it's not about literally humiliating yourself or getting undignified, or it's about being less esteemed, right? It's that comparison between where we are, how we are viewed, and how God is viewed, and how we're lifting up God, right? And it's not just during worship. Yes, that is legitimate, and so I'm sure all of our worship leaders will love it if you guys all started jumping up and down, worshiping, screaming, and lifting your hands up. That's wonderful, right? I'm not. It is that, but I'm not. It's so much more. It's about your everyday life. You know, it's about. I mean, here's the truth about just life, right? There are things, and then this is true for all stages of life, student, and career, right? There are things that are not honoring to God that can really help you get ahead. That's just the facts, right? In your studies, in your career, there will be times when doing something that doesn't honor God could help your career or education. And in that moment, right, that could be one of those, hey, am I willing to be less esteemed by lifting God up? Because the world will look at that and think, you are crazy. All you had to do this. All you had to do was this thing that doesn't honor the Lord, but all you had to do was that. And that could have gotten you a better grade. That would have gotten you a promotion, right? That puts you on the right path. Like, there are times, not always, but like, you could get yourself off track in your career. That's not a one-time thing, but it cascades, and you just look, oh my career now is off track, all because you chose to lift up the Lord and to follow him and to obey him, right? That's what I mean, like this idea of like, am I willing to be undignified, right? Because the world will look at that and say like, man, you squandered an opportunity. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves, whether it's wherever you are in life, right? So when it comes to, are you willing to lower yourself to lift up God? It is how we present ourselves in worship, but it's so much more than that. The second thing is understand and receive God's grace. And what I mean by that is when I say understand, I mean truly know that you don't deserve anything good from God. That's a hard one. I think that's foolishness to the world. That's like, what do you mean you don't deserve anything good from God? Like, you are awesome. You deserve great things, right? But no, like, who we are and what we've done, we don't deserve that. And then receive the good things that God gives out of his grace. That's where it's where it gets a little bit difficult, right? Understand and receive God's grace. Understand that we don't deserve it, and then take it because God is giving it, because God loves us, right? When you can, those are it's kind of a weird thing, but when you can take those two ideas of like, yeah, I don't deserve any of this, and then you just take it because God is giving you his grace, that's like that really opens up your faith, because then it's like you have this joy because of God's grace, and there's but then all pride and arrogance just goes away, right? And that's what's tricky, because sometimes we receive God's grace, but there's this little thing in the back of our head that says, good job with your devotions, hey, you were nice to that person, this is why you got this, received it. That is, all right, it's so easy for us to get like that. And that is totally not what God's grace is about. And so understand that we don't deserve any of it, and then receive God's grace. And ultimately, right, the ultimate expression of God's grace is salvation through Christ, right? There's God's grace that God gives us every day, but then like the ultimate expression is our salvation through Jesus Christ. Okay. And so the third thing is this: know God and trust in God's promises. In John chapter 10, verse 10, it says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Remember, God's promises might not be what you're expecting. And God does not promise an easy life. What God promises is that following Him is worth it. And that's kind of vague, right? But that's God's promise. God's like, hey, if you follow me, it's going to be worth it. How does that play out? I don't know. I don't know how it's going to play out for everybody's life. But God's promises, it's always greater than we expect. We so many times we think of like the worst, like, okay, it'll be worth it. Yeah, I'll get heaven in the end, and that makes all the hardships of life worth it. Okay, and then we're like Eeyore for the rest of our lives. And we're like, no. I mean, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but God says it's worth it in this life and in the next life. Right? It's scary. It is scary. But remember, this section, this John chapter 10 section, it's about Jesus being the good shepherd. And to know God is to know Jesus. And to know Jesus is to know God, like the good shepherd. And then the next verse, John chapter 10, verse 11, it says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And so as you think about how God is promising that following him will be a life that's worth it, always go back to, what did God do? God is the good shepherd. Christ is the good shepherd, and he laid down his life for his sheep for us. And if that is our God, it's okay not to know how that promise plays out, but we can trust